why do you think that we've got to this place? Why are we here where capitalism, free markets, and self-interest are being seen as vices, and things like, you know, pathological altruism and collectivism are seen as virtues?
You always talk about Venezuela. You always talk about Venezuela. Can I talk? Can I talk? In their schools. Can I talk? Sure. Right. Let's talk about socialism. Right. Let's talk about democratic control of means production. Right. Like Cuba. Like Cuba.
Well, there's a lot of answers to that question, but let me just start with the first point. First of all, I think we need to have an accurate understanding of what self-interest is, particularly as people like Adam Smith talked about it. When Smith talks about self-interest, he doesn't mean selfishness. He doesn't mean greed. It's very clear he doesn't mean these things, because, not least because he condemns things like greed in other parts of his writings. What he's talking about is the interest of the self. And the self that we're talking about, and certainly Smith is talking about, is a very complicated being. We do things, we pursue things that we believe to be in our interests, but our interests go beyond just material acquisition. Our interests can include things like our spouse, our family, those who are close to us, the institutions of civil society that are around us, those who work for us, those who we work for. So the self is not just a more complicated being than the sort of materialistic understanding that I think is often articulated by critics of the idea. It's also a being that's intimately involved in relationships with other people, because we are social beings. We are, by definition, involved in relationships with other people. We can't exist without other people. So I think that's the first thing. We need to be clear about what we mean by self-interest. But we also need to be clear about where some of these negative views have arisen from. And there's, I think, some long-term causes and some are more immediate causes. So some of the long-term causes, I think, are, frankly, the deep influence of Marxist thinking, Marxist imagery, and Marxist assumptions about the world. I mean, it's often tempting to think that all that came to an end in 1989 when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I think it's very difficult to understand the world today without understanding that many people still have that mindset. So when they look at capitalism, they're looking for exploitation. They don't see it in terms of people working together in commercial relationships, mutually benefiting from exchange. They see one person taking from another. They also see things in terms of class. There's the working class, then there's the middle class, the bourgeois. These are, by definition, the exploitative people. Even the everyday language that we use, I think, often reflects this widespread influence of Marxist ideology a long time after books like Das Kapital were first written. So that's a sort of very long-term reason. Another reason, however, or so let's call it more proximate reasons, and I think this is explains a great deal about some of the people that you described at the beginning, millennials, etc., who often had these very negative views of capitalism. There's two things going on. One is these are people who in many respects have grown up with no memory or no knowledge of what it was like to live with societies in the world in which central planning was a norm. We have entire generations of people who don't know who Joseph Stalin was, or who don't know just how bad the centrally planned economies that were produced by people like him, but many other people, just how bad they were. But even in what you might call those who are arguing in favor of social democracy, which I think is much more common these days, what you find is they have no appreciation of what the reality of Swedish 1970s social democracy was actually like, or the fact that Scandinavian countries abandoned those models in the 1970s because they were economically and socially recognized as having very, very bad effects on these countries. But another thing I think is, I talk about this often, and I think it's this. We can't underestimate just how much damage I think was done to the image of capitalism and free markets by the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Great Recession. Now, I could sit down and we could talk about all the ways in which bad government policies, whether it was housing policies implemented by the Clinton administration and continued by the Bush administration, or whether it was things like the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates way too low for too long. We can talk about all the effects that bad government policies had in causing the financial crisis. But guess what? We lost that argument. And I don't mean lost in terms of we had a worse argument, or our argument didn't make sense. But in terms of the PR side of things, the dominant narrative was that this was a failure of capitalism. And therefore we need lots more government intervention in the economy to make sure that this never ever happens again.
Capitalism, as we know it, is dead. This obsession that we have had with maximizing profits for shareholders alone has led to incredible inequality and a planetary emergency.
Today, capitalism dominates the world. But many of Marx's criticisms have never been more relevant. Today, the global disparity between rich and poor is striking. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to the rich getting richer and the poor staying poor. He was right. He also predicted that capitalism would lead to boom and bust economics.
So even today, the financial crisis happened, almost 14 years ago now. But that is still hanging over many people's minds when they think about capitalism, and why they often have quite negative views of this, and why they're willing to think about things like, well, maybe we should have some intervention. Maybe a few tariffs wouldn't be bad. Maybe the occasional industrial policy would be a good idea. I don't think we can underestimate the legacy of free marketers losing the public relations battle about what was the real cause of the 2008 financial crisis, if we want to understand why such negative views of capitalism are quite prevalent among a good number of people today.